Alright, welcome to another web development video where I show you how to make websites, modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video I'm going to show you how to create and to use your own Json data for your website or for your application. In previous videos I have showed you how to use an API to go outside of your website and get data for your application. In this one I'm going to show you how to use internal data in order to populate your app. So when we output it to the HTML page, it's going to look very similar as the other videos, but getting the data is a little bit different because it's right inside of your JavaScript file. And in a companion video I'm planning to show you how to put your JSON into its own JSON file. It's a .json file. And then it's sort of the middle ground of it won't be inside of your like app.js main file, but it'll be in its own file, and then you'll have to sort of do the API call, but you're not going outside of your website, so it should be faster than getting data from another source. And it'll also set you up for being able to use a form or some way for users to manipulate that data, or for yourself to manipulate that data with form fields, as opposed to going through like we're going to do and just building the JSON by hand. So this is what we have. We have 3 groups. Each of our groups has some data attached to it. So there's a source URL here. There's a title of the book, and then there's an author, and then we have this blurb that is a piece of data itself. So these are the pieces of data that we're going to put into our JSON object, and then we're going to go loop through that JSON object, get the variables, and then we're going to output HTML through the JavaScript and then insert the HTML, just like we did with the other APIs if you saw the other API videos that I have. But it's about how we get the data that's a little bit different in this video. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a variable, and this variable is going to be called data, and data is going to have an object inside of it. If you're not familiar with objects, if you watch the other API videos and you feel lost, then you probably need to just brush up on your JavaScript or object-oriented programming or whatever language you're using, and you're going to need to know about objects, arrays, and for each loops. So if you don't know about those are pretty low-level programming concepts. So go back and learn them, and then if you come back here, you should be able to understand what's going on. I am certainly no genius in this area, but I just watched a lot of videos and figured some stuff out. So for our data, this is where all of our data is going to be held, in this variable. So then we'll be able to console log it and see it and be able to work our way through the data. So it works on the JSON works on key value pairs. So there's a key on the left side and there's a value on the right. Now that value is associated with that key, so that if you have the key, then you can get access to that data. And it's a way of going through data and pulling out particular information. I find it easier when I'm writing JSON to start at the smallest levels possible. So the smallest level possible for us in this example is going to be this sort of this column. Like each column is going to be our smallest unit, okay, that has all of our data in it. So the first thing we need to get is the image URL, which is this piece of data right here. And we're going to store all of our data, remember, into this object. So our image URL is like a label. So when you see image URL, you know that the value that comes with it is going to be what comes on the right side. And when you store image URL in a variable, the value is what's going to be stored. So on the right side of the colon, that's what's going to be stored in the variable. So we want our first one to be this. So let's just copy that and paste it in. And then we can have multiple pieces of data here. We just have to separate them by a comma. So our next key value pair is going to be a title. And then our title is going to be the Persian Gamble. We're going to create another piece of data, and that's going to be an author. That's the key, the label, and that's going to be Joel C. Rosenberg. And then finally, our last piece of data we're going to call blurb, and that's going to be this sort of summary or back of the book blurb, and we're going to call that blurb. And what I'm going to do is, instead of just getting the raw data, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm just going to use the data with the HTML in it. So if I come up here, I can just get that data like that. You would normally want to keep your data clean. You want it to just be strings if you can help it. And then we would have a sort of, one of these would be a paragraph. So inside a blurb you would have paragraph, and then inside of that you would have a couple of objects, and then you would build that out accordingly. But I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm just going to put this HTML in there. That part's not as important. That's more about streamlining your code and making it better in the end. I'm just here to show you how to do this right now. So there was a space there, so we're getting an error, so just make sure clear up that space. So now we have our pieces of data, right? So inside of this data variable, we can see the key value pairs of image URL, title, author, blurb. So if we come down and we console log our data, then we expect to be able to see this data in the browser, in the console. So let's come down, we'll open our console, and we can see here that it returns an object, right? So inside of this, there is an object, and that object has several key value pairs. So when we look into this object, we see our key value pairs show up. Okay, we have our author, our blurb, our image URL, and our title. Now if we output this to the screen, we only have one book. The problem is we have 3 books. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to duplicate this 3 times. So what we do with objects like this, so this is an object from the curly brace, wasn't what I wanted. So from the curly brace to the curly brace, this is an object. That's what it tells us up here, right? It tells us this is an object. Now if we want to make 3 of these objects, but the problem is this is sort of an outside container object for JSON. So you could create 3 different variables if you wanted to. It's overkill. It's not really what JSON is about. You are actually able to create those books inside of this structure. So let's go in and we'll make a new key, and that key is just going to be called books. Now normally we would have a key value pair like this, and you would get some sort of value on the right side that books points to, right? But the problem is we want 3 of these, and we can't just put that inside of parentheses because it's not a string, it's a set of key value pairs, an object. And the way that we group objects is that we use an array. So we use the square brackets. So what we're saying is inside of this key value pair, this key, the value is going to be an array of objects, and our objects all hold this information. So the way that we write this is it's going to look like this. Sorry, it's going to be curly braces, and then for each curly brace we need to also have a comma. Now we have 3 books, so we need 3 curly braces. Our structure is going to look like this. So it's an array of books. Each book is going to be inside of these curly braces. Now for the last one in an array, the last item in an array, you don't need a comma. So just to let you know. But all the others, it'll throw an error if you don't have a comma in between all of the objects in your array. Now I'm going to just sort of do this. I just wanted to show you that for example, but I don't want to structure it like that. This is how I want to structure it. So I'm going to take all of these key value pairs that I created. I'm going to hit Control X, so I'm cutting them, and I'm going to paste them right in here. I'll straighten that up a little bit. So now we have our object. Remember, this is our object right here. So we have all of our object represented by our curly braces inside of an array. Okay, so that's one book. And if we just copy and paste this, we can wind up with 3 books. So we copy and paste once, and we copy and paste twice. And we should wind up with 3 books. Getting some funky things going on here. Let's just line this up a little bit better. So we have 3 books. Remember the last one, you don't need a comma, and that's part of our array. Okay, so it's actually can be moved over there. So that's a part of our array. We're going to clean up the styling a little bit in just a minute, I think. So now we have our 3 books. So now we need to be able to access this though. If we just console log this, things have changed. So now we see that our outward object contains a key, and the value of that key is an array with 3 objects in it. So if we click on that and we go and we get down to this level where our key is, we can see our objects. So each one is in an array, right? These could have been strings, they could have been all kinds of things, but we have 3 objects inside this collection, this array. And if we go inside of that array, then we see each of our individual books. Okay. At this point, each of our individual books is all the same, so we need to go through and make each book actually individual. But this is the structure that we ultimately want to be able to get to so that we can loop through this and output all this data out to our website. So let's go through real fast and just sort of change input our data the right way. So this is going to be book number 2, which is where here. So this is book number 2, and it's called Dead Heat. So put that there, same author, and then we also need to get our HTML, right? So we're going to get our HTML from book number 2. Come down to book 2 and put it in between the quotes, just like that. Remember, we have spacing issues here, so we just got to get rid of those spaces that are automatically created from the HTML up here. And then let's go ahead and just get the HTML from the last one, since we're in this view already. And we'll just copy that, go back to our pug, and we'll come down to our last one. And the last book in the array, in between the quotes, and we'll get rid of our spaces, just like that. And now each of our pieces of data is almost different. We need to change this. Auschwitz escape, and then we need to get our source file from the last one. So let's do that. And we'll put that here where our image file is. Let's save it, and then we can look at our data in the console. So we come back, we have the full object here, right? This is what we get whenever we console log our data variable. And then inside of that there is a key with the value of an array, and then inside that array is each of our individual books. So we have the Persian Gamble, Dead Heat, the Auschwitz Escape, and then all of these blurbs are different as well. So this is all the information that we took in. You can see it better if you do it like this. So you can see our key value pairs, and it's going through each of these and it's outputting them because they're all part of our array. Now that's how you transfer the data from your website up here to your JSON. Now I'm going to give you a little tip on your JSON when you're writing JSON by hand. It's very easy to just mess things up. So let's just copy all of our JSON, and this is the JSON, not this. Okay, this is JavaScript, and this is not the JSON object. Okay, so let's go to a site called jsonlint.com, and when we get to JSONlint, we're going to just simply paste our code in. Oh, we didn't copy it, huh? Copy our code, and then we're going to paste it in here. So now you can see this is all of our JSON, and then I'm going to click validate JSON, and so it's just going to tell me, is it valid JSON or not? Okay, so have I messed something up? Did I leave out a comma? It's really easy to mess up the structure of your JSON. So let's just copy that. In fact, I don't need to because it was validated, but what I'm going to do is just use their styling. So they restyled my JSON a little bit. So I'm just going to use what they did. Make sure everything is in the right places and all that kind of stuff. So we still have everything together. It checks out here, and you see all of our books in our array. All right, congratulations. You have successfully written JSON, and you've attached it to the data variable, which we can then go through and use later. So at this point, your data is exactly like in the other API videos where you've gone outside to a different website and you brought it in through their API. So this would be all the information inside their inside the query that you make to their database, and then they deliver it just like this, but they're doing all that for you. So right now you've learned how to write it by hand, which is a really great skill to have, especially if you have sort of a small website or you want to do your own input and changing, or a CMS where you're changing the data inside the JSON file, which is way out of the scope for me. I only know how to do that through certain third-party things like Firebase. So I'm not going to console log this data anymore. I just don't need it in the same way. And what I'm going to do is we need to find some way to get this data now into a function that's going to take and create variables for all of these pieces of information so that we can use them later. And then after we do that, then we need a way to output all of this data to the grid. What's it called? To the grid, which is just called grid in the grid container. And then that's going to be the completion. So we're about halfway through. We need to create a function called getData. And then I'm going to come down and I'm just going to call that function because I seem to forget that all the time. And I don't need that. Let's do this. So this is what our function is going to look like. And the first thing that we need to do is realize that we can begin to navigate this data element here. So whenever we use an object, which a variable is an object, you can get inside of that object to the key value pairs by using what's called dot notation. So if we say console.log data dot, and then we find a key inside of data, we only have one key now. So our key is books. So if we say data dot books and we console log that, I want you to see right here that we're sort of outside of books. Okay, that was when we were calling data. Now when we call data.books, we're going to land at this level right here, and all you'll see is sort of what's underneath that. So you can see now that we're on the books level. We don't have to go into the books level. That's because when we said data.books, we went into the data object, and then we went straight to books. Okay, and then we still have the same data here. It's just that we're entering into that data set at a different level. This is sort of a way of circumventing having to do a bunch of loops and stuff like that. So we only want to do loops where we need to do loops. Okay, that's generally what we need to do. So let's make this call right here to data.books. Let's make that an actual variable that we can then loop through, because the thing that we ultimately want to do is we want to loop through each of these books, and we want to get the author name, the blurb, the image URL, and the title, and put those into a variable. So we want to do that for every one of these books. So for the first one, and then for the second one, and then for the third one. So that's, to do that, we're going to use a variable so that we can get in a little cleaner and drier and do that. So the variable is going to be called book list, and book list is going to be equal to what we just looked at, which is data.books. Just exactly what we just console logged. So that if you console log this book list, you're going to get the exact same thing that we had before. Okay, so I'm actually going to just not do that. And now we need to loop through our book list and then do something each time that we loop. So in jQuery, we use the $.each. This is a for each loop. If you're in JavaScript, you would actually do a for each loop. If you're in vanilla JavaScript, sorry. We want to loop through the book list, and then we want to do some function. Okay, we want to do something each time that we loop through. So what this says in plain English is, for each book or each object in the book list, do something, do whatever is here. And so it's going to do it for one book, and then it's going to come back around and do it for another and another and another until there are no more objects inside of this book list. Okay, for us that's 3. So after 3 it'll stop, the loop will stop, and then it'll execute whatever code comes afterwards. Okay, so let's go in here, and what we want to do is we want to get all of our information. Okay, I can look in here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of information, and we need to collect these values on the right hand side for each of these keys. So remember our dot notation, right? So we've gone into the book list, and now instead of doing data, we could do data.books, and then we have to go somewhere else, but we already have our book list set up. So we can use that variable, and we can say book, I'm sorry, let me get in here. It needs an index and a value. So for each book, it's going to return a value, and you'll see that here. So let's say console.log, and we'll log the value that is returned each time, and it should be each of our books. Okay, so you can see that we're returning the value of each time that it loops through. So each time it goes through the book list, do something. Return an index, which is like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a value, which also is an object here. Okay, so our value here is an object. And so we're console logging that value, and so we're getting the actual object. We're getting this object here is what's being returned. That's the value of our for each loop. Okay, so we can let's just leave that here. I'm going to need that. We can create a variable. The first thing that I want to collect is this image URL. Now we go into each of these. So each time it runs, we want to go into author, and we want to get that piece of information. So the way that we can do that, we can say variable author. Let's do the image URL first. So the image URL is going to be equal to val, and then we go into our value and we grab this image URL. So val.image URL, and then we're also going to console log the image URL. So when we come out here, when we refresh the page, it should have each of our objects. Actually, is it going to? No. It's going to show us all of the image URLs inside of each of these objects. So you can see here it console logs all of these different image URLs, and if we click on it, we can see that the actual URLs are dead. They're different. So it's doing its job. It's looping through all of these, and each time it goes through one of these, it looks at the image URL, it takes this value, and it sets it into this variable image URL. That's all that's happening. So we need to get more. We have 4 pieces of data, and so the second piece of data is going to be the title, and the third piece of data is going to be called author, and the fourth piece of data is going to be called blurb. Blurb, that's this part. So if we go through each of the books in our book list, for each one, get the image URL, the title, the author, the blurb, and hold it in these different variables. That's all we're telling the program to do at this point. So let's save it, and it should output each of those pieces of information for each book as it rolls through, which it does. So URL, title, author, blurb, URL, title, author, blurb, and it just keeps going through for as long as we have objects inside of our book list. Okay, it'll do it forever. If you have 100, then it'll do this 100 times. Now we need a way to take this information, because it doesn't do any good to just log it to the console. We need to take this information and we need to make it tangible and usable for our application, which means we need to output it to the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here, and we need to create what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a second grid, and you'll see why in just a minute. I'm going to set a second grid down here, and what we want to do is we want to choose the grid, because remember we're going to get rid of all this hard-coded HTML, and we're going to instead insert it through the JavaScript. So we're going to take the grid and we're going to say append, and what append does is it goes to the grid container element, and then it starts at the top of the element or at the bottom of the element, and then it adds whatever is here, and then it's going to go to the bottom of the element again, and it's going to add whatever is here, and it's going to keep doing that for as long as our for loop is going. So we have 3 books. It's going to do that appending 3 times. Okay, and what we want to append is we want to take this grid item right here, and we want to come in and for each loop we get our variables, and then we insert the variables into these places, and then we output the grid item to this grid, and not just output it, but we append it. So for the first item, grid doesn't have anything, so it's just going to go first. For the second item, when it loops through, it's going to find the bottom of .grid, the last element, and it's going to add a grid item to the last element, and then it's going to go to the third one and add a grid item to the last element, and so on for as many items as you have in your book list. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. You're going to see it in action, and you're not really going to be able to see what's happening, so I'm just trying to explain to you if you don't understand. What we want to do is make this easy for us, so we're appending some HTML code. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this grid item, because that's all the code that we really want to append. And then we need to put it in here. It needs to go inside of single or double quotes, because it's not a variable. If you wanted to make this all into a variable, you could do that and then put it inside the the parentheses, but that's not how I'm going to show you. I'm going to leave this styling here because we need to go through and we need to get each of our variables and we need to input it into this HTML, so we don't have this. If we leave it like this, it'll do 3 of the same thing. It'll just roll through, and each time it'll append this grid item right here. But we don't want that. We want to have a specific image URL, a title, an author, and a blurb for each book. Okay. So the way that we add variables to the HTML when you're outputting from JavaScript is that we use single quotes. I'm going to use single quotes here, and I'm going to use 2 plus signs, and this is called concatenation. If you don't know about concatenation, it just means you're sort of squishing 2 things together. You're inserting it. The first thing that we need to do is insert our image URL, right? So that's our first variable, image URL. And then we need to come down here, and instead of hard coding our title, we want it to change every time, or we want it to follow the data. That's what we really want it to do. So then we're going to say title, and then for our author, we have the same author, so it doesn't make a lot of sense in this particular application, but if you had multiple authors, you would want to get the author and make sure that changes over time. So author, and then here, that gets cut down a lot, and all we're going to write in here is our single quotes plus plus and blurb. Okay. Now we're still getting an error here. That's because of spacing issues. So once we shore that up, it should remove any issues, any errors that we're receiving. So we do that there, we do that there, and you can see that our errors go away, and also everything is green except for our variables. Usually in a code editor, your variables are going to look different than your HTML, which is what happens here. So they're connected by the blue. So what we're saying when we run get data is that we look in the book list, which is at data.books, and then for each book in the book list, or each object in the book list, we're going to run this function. And that function at first goes through and collects all of the variable pieces of information, URL, title, author, blurb. It gets that for each book, each object in the book list, saves them, goes down here, goes to grid, and then outputs this code using these variables, which are different each time it rolls through, each time it loops through. Each of these variables is going to be based on what is up here, what you put up here. And then it's going to append that to the grid. So it's going to take all this code and it's going to append that HTML to the grid, and it's going to make it look just like this because it's going to put one grid item and then it's going to loop through, get new variables, put it into the HTML, append that to the end of that grid container, come through a third time, get new variables, and append that to the bottom of the grid container, and it should give us exactly what we see here. It's not going to be like some amazing ta-da moment. It's going to look exactly like this. The problem is we already have this sort of here. So in order to show it well, I'm just going to comment this out, and you're going to see it flash, and then it's going to show the exact same thing. It doesn't look any different. The only difference is the HTML is no longer serving this page. The JavaScript is serving it to this grid container. And the way that you can test that is you can just comment out get data, and it shouldn't show anything because it's requiring this function to run get data in order to output any HTML. Okay, and then when you bring it back, then the function runs and you get your data sent back here. All the CSS styles still hold, and you're able to use data from your application to be able to fill in the HTML. Now there are ways that you can make this more performant. There are ways that you could just make it generally better or easier or different. I understand that. This is sort of the basics of how this works. And in a second video, I'm going to show you how to take this JSON object and put it into a separate JSON file. And then you're going to make an API call, essentially, to go not to another server like an HTTP request. You're going to make a call to Nextdoor. So you're going to get the you're just going to tap whatever .json, like data.json, and you say, hey, give me that information. So it's not going to be in your app.js file or whatever your main.js file is. It's going to be in a separate file. So you're starting to sort of get into some more compartmentalization, maybe easier to maintain, and that sort of thing. But you have essentially a database, which is what you would be accessing for this type of information. You have your own personal database that you just made. This is a very small scale, but you did just make a database, and it's all in one single file, and a very small file at that. And you're not having to go outside to a database, make a call to the information, rearrange the information on the page, and then output it. It's literally going, it's already being loaded into the page. Your JavaScript is just going, you know, a couple of feet away, brings it back and puts it into your application. That's why it loads so quickly, because every time this loads, it's going to load this data, and you can see how quickly it loads. Like when you load new data, it doesn't take very long for it to load. That's a hard refresh, and a lot of that is because this is actually going off of this website in order to bring in that data. So even though it's going out to a third-party website to get the image URL and the image itself, it's hot linked to another website, it's still loading really fast because you're getting all the data straight from your own website. So hopefully that's not too complicated or too complex, and I hope that it's interesting enough for you to play around with it and start doing some things with it. I've used it on some applications that I've made recently, some web apps, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do that, and you'll get notifications whenever I post new videos, usually once or twice a week. And also, if you have any comments or questions about this structure or what I'm doing or what does this mean, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I'll try to get to them as best I can, and I always try to point you to resources. If I can't answer it personally, maybe I can point you to a resource that would help you along the way. Alright, well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.